Human pulled an alien girl from the falling cliff dust. Her first gentle question changed him. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. The wind howled through the jagged cliffs, carrying with it the scent of dust and the chill of an oncoming storm. The ground trembled slightly beneath James Harper's boots as he crouched low, scanning the rocky terrain below. His heart raced, his breath visible in the freezing air. He had been tracking the strange phenomenon for days now, an unexplained energy surge that had led him to this desolate, windswept cliffside on the outer rim of a forgotten planet. As he carefully peered over the edge, he saw a figure silhouetted against the setting sun, clinging to the crumbling rock face. It was a girl, an alien girl. Her skin was a vibrant shade of green, almost like the forests of Earth, but the fear in her wide, golden eyes was unmistakable. She struggled to find her footing, her fingers scraping at the rock as the ground beneath her gave way. Without a second thought, James dashed forward, reaching the ledge just as she lost her grip. His hand shot out, grasping her wrist with surprising strength. "Hold on," he shouted, pulling with all his might. The alien girl gasped, her small, fragile form almost weightless in his grasp. She kicked her legs, desperately trying to find a foothold, but the wind howled louder, threatening to tear her from his grip. He felt the strain in his arms as he pulled her upward, his boots sliding on the loose stone. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, the cliff edge becoming a dizzying blur of rock and sky. With one final, desperate lunge, James hauled her over the edge, collapsing to the ground with the alien girl safely in his arms. He took a deep breath, his chest heaving with the effort, and looked down at the girl in his arms. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling from the cold, but her golden eyes were locked onto his, filled with an emotion he couldn't quite place. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft and melodic, yet filled with an underlying strength. James nodded, still trying to catch his breath. "It's all right. You're safe now." The girl's eyes never left his. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely more than a breath. "Why did you help me?" Her question hung in the air between them, as if it held the key to something much bigger than the simple act of saving her life. James paused, caught off guard by the depth in her words. He had helped her because it was the right thing to do, but this was something else. The alien girl, despite her fear and vulnerability, seemed to understand something about him, something he hadn't even realized himself. And in that moment, as the storm raged around them, James found himself wondering if his life was about to change in ways he could never have imagined. The question echoed in his mind. "Why did you help me?" As the wind continued to howl, he knew that the answer was much more complicated than he had ever thought. James took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling with the effort of his rescue. He could feel the cold air of the cliffside biting at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the sudden stillness that settled between him and the alien girl. She sat up slowly, her vibrant green skin shimmering slightly in the low light as the wind howled around them. The storm had only intensified, the cold biting at their skin, but in that moment, there was only the sound of her voice, soft yet powerful, as it lingered in the air. "Why did you help me?" she asked again, her golden eyes searching his, as if trying to unravel a mystery hidden within him. James looked down at her, still trying to catch his breath. He wasn't sure how to answer. Why had he helped her? It wasn't a decision, it was instinct. "I just couldn't leave you there," he replied, his voice steady. But there was a depth to it that surprised him. The alien girl tilted her head slightly, as though considering his words carefully. There was no judgment in her gaze, only curiosity. "You're different," she said quietly. James was about to respond, but he hesitated. What could he say to someone from another world who, despite her vulnerability, seemed so full of strength and resilience? Her golden eyes glinted in the dim light, and she slowly extended her hand towards him. "Thank you," she said again, this time with a softness that tugged at something deep inside of him. As her fingers brushed his, he felt an unspoken connection, a sense of trust that had formed between them in an instant. James stared at her hand for a moment, the weight of the situation sinking in. She was an alien, someone from a distant planet, and yet in this moment, she was just a person, like him, in need of help. "I'm Lyra," she said, her voice almost a whisper, as though the name itself carried a weight of its own. "I'm James," he replied, a little breathlessly. "I know," she said, her gaze softening. "I could feel you the moment you reached for me. You didn't just pull me from the edge, you pulled me into your world." James frowned slightly, unsure of what she meant. He didn't know how to explain it either, but he understood what she was saying. The pull between them wasn't just physical. It was something else, something deeper. The wind continued to howl around them, and the temperature was dropping rapidly. James looked around, realizing how exposed they were. He had to get them to safety. "We need to move," he said, standing up and offering her a hand. She took it without hesitation, rising to her feet with surprising grace, despite the storm's intensity. As they made their way down the cliffside, the sound of the wind was deafening, but it wasn't enough to drown out the thoughts racing in James's mind. What had just happened? Why did he feel so connected to her, so responsible for her, despite the vast differences between them? Lyra, on the other hand, seemed calm, as though she was processing everything with a quiet intensity. "Why did you ask me that?" James finally asked, the question slipping out before he could stop himself. She glanced up at him, her golden eyes searching his face as if to gauge his sincerity. "Because," she said softly, "I've never met anyone like you before. Your actions don't make sense, but somehow, they do. You've helped me. Because you could, not because you were asked to. That's rare." James couldn't help but feel a pang in his chest. The way she saw him, as someone who acted out of pure kindness, made him feel like he was seeing himself for the first time through someone else's eyes. He was more than just the soldier, the rescuer. He was human, capable of kindness, capable of change. "I guess," he said, looking at her with a sense of awe he couldn't quite explain. "I just did what felt right." They continued down the path, the storm swirling around them, but for the first time in a long while, James didn't feel quite so alone. He wasn't sure where their journey would lead, or how it would change them both, but he knew one thing. Whatever happened, they would face it together. The connection between them, however inexplicable, had already begun to alter the course of his life. And as the wind howled, James couldn't help but wonder if this was the beginning of something neither of them could have ever predicted. The wind continued to howl around them as James and Lyra made their way down the rocky cliffside. Each step felt heavy as the temperature dropped, the biting cold cutting through their clothing. James glanced at her, noticing the way she moved with a quiet grace, her alien features illuminated by the faint glow of the storm. There was something otherworldly about her, something that made him feel even more connected to her despite the vast differences between their species. It wasn't just her appearance, her golden eyes, her vibrant green skin. It was the way she held herself, the way she seemed so at ease in the face of danger. She was different from any person he had ever met. They reached a small cave just below the cliff's edge, offering a brief respite from the storm. James helped Lyra inside, his muscles aching from the effort of the climb, but the warmth of the cave was a welcome relief. As they settled in, the wind outside began to pick up again, but inside, it was relatively quiet. James took a deep breath, his heart still racing from the intensity of the rescue. He turned to Lyra, who was sitting on the cave floor, her posture still regal despite the circumstances. She was carefully brushing the dust and debris from her clothes, as if nothing had happened. James watched her for a moment, unsure of what to say. It was hard to break the silence that hung between them, a silence filled with questions he didn't know how to ask. Lyra caught his gaze and smiled softly. "You're wondering why I'm not afraid," she said, as though reading his mind. James blinked, surprised by her words. "I wasn't thinking about that," he replied, though in truth, it was exactly what he had been wondering. "I guess. I'm just not used to this kind of thing. I mean, I've been on missions before, but this feels different." Lyra tilted her head slightly, her golden eyes narrowing as she studied him. "You think we're that different, don't you? That I'm something alien?" Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge of sadness to it, something he hadn't expected. James shook his head. "No. I mean, yeah, you're different, But that's not what I meant. I don't know what I meant. Lyra's smile softened, and she nodded. It's okay. I understand. She stood up and walked over to him, her movements fluid and graceful. But you're right. We are different. My kind is not like yours. We've evolved differently. We've lived in different worlds, with different struggles. She paused for a moment, her gaze flickering to the entrance of the cave. But that doesn't mean we can't understand each other. It doesn't mean we can't find common ground. James watched her, his thoughts racing. He had never met anyone like Lyra before, and the way she spoke, so calmly and with such depth, made him feel like he was seeing the world through a new lens. The storm outside seemed to fade away as the silence stretched between them. Finally, he spoke. I guess that's what I've been thinking, he said. That we're different, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe it's what makes us better. Lyra smiled, her eyes lighting up with a warmth that made his chest tighten. Perhaps you're right, she said softly. The moment hung in the air between them, the quiet of the cave broken only by the sound of their breathing. For a long time, neither of them spoke. But as the storm raged on outside, James realized something. He had come here thinking that he was just doing his job, rescuing someone from danger. But now, sitting in the cave with Lyra, he understood that it was more than that. There was something deeper, something that went beyond the storm, beyond the danger. There was a connection between them, something neither of them had expected, but both of them could feel. And as he looked at her, his thoughts drifted to what lay ahead. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he was willing to face it. Together, the night settled in around them as James and Lyra sat side by side in the small cave, the warmth from their makeshift fire the only source of light in the darkness. The storm outside had intensified, the wind now a constant, howling presence, rattling the rocks around them. Yet, inside the cave, it was calm, still, almost serene. James glanced over at Lyra, who was staring into the fire, her expression contemplative. Her golden eyes glimmered in the flickering light, and for a moment, he saw not an alien, but a person, just like him. You're thinking again, he said quietly, breaking the silence. Lyra turned to look at him, her expression softening. I can't help it, she replied, her voice gentle. There's so much I don't understand. James raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Lyra's gaze shifted back to the fire. About you. About humans. About everything. Her words hung in the air, filled with an emotion that was difficult to place. James was used to people, used to dealing with difficult situations. But Lyra, she was different. She wasn't afraid, not in the way he expected. We're not that complicated, he said with a slight chuckle. I mean, we've got our flaws, sure, but at the end of the day, we do what we do because we think it's right. Lyra smiled faintly, though it was tinged with sadness. That's what I've been trying to understand. Why do you help us? Why did you help me? James thought about it for a moment. I didn't really think about it. I just did it. Something about you, about this place, it felt like I couldn't leave you behind. Lyra nodded slowly, as though processing his words. I've never met anyone like you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. On my planet, people like you, we don't have them. We're taught to survive, not to save. That's a shame, James said softly, feeling a pang of sympathy. I don't know much about your world, but you should know there's more to life than just surviving. The fire crackled, the soft sound filling the silence between them. Lyra turned her gaze toward him, her eyes searching, as if looking for something she hadn't quite found yet. What do you think it is? She asked, her voice carrying a deep, almost philosophical tone. James was caught off guard by the question. What did he think it was? He had never really thought about it before. I don't know, he said after a beat. But I think it's about making connections. About understanding each other, even if we're from different places. That's what makes life worth living. Lyra was silent for a long time, her eyes never leaving him. James could see the wheels turning in her mind, the way she was processing everything, trying to fit the pieces together. Finally, she spoke again, her voice softer. You're not like the others, she said, almost to herself. James wasn't sure what she meant, but he didn't press her for an explanation. Instead, he sat back, letting the silence settle between them again. The storm outside had subsided somewhat, and the only sounds now were the crackling of the fire and the occasional shift of the rocks. As they sat there, side by side, James realized that in the brief moments they had shared together, something had changed, not just in him, but in Lyra too. There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken bond that neither of them had expected. James wasn't sure where this journey would lead, or how it would unfold. But as he looked at Lyra, sitting there with him in the cave, he knew that whatever happened, they would face it together. The night stretched on, and for the first time in a long while, James felt a sense of peace he hadn't realized he had been searching for. Lyra had changed him in ways he couldn't yet understand, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't alone anymore. They weren't alone, and that was enough. The days that followed were quieter, though the storm outside had yet to subside. James and Lyra had settled into a routine, finding comfort in the simplicity of their shared silence. The fire crackled softly in the cave, casting warm shadows on the walls as the two of them worked together to gather supplies. James had taken on the role of protector, keeping a close watch on the weather and the terrain outside. Lyra, in turn, had become more comfortable in his presence, her earlier wariness replaced by a quiet curiosity. Despite the calmness between them, there was still something unspoken hanging in the air, something neither of them knew how to address. As they sat together one evening, James found himself watching her. She was staring out at the storm, her face calm and contemplative, yet there was a distant look in her eyes. He had noticed it before, that sense of longing she carried with her. It was as if she was waiting for something she couldn't quite put into words. James wasn't sure what it was, but he felt the need to ask. "What are you thinking about?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the silence. Lyra turned to him, her golden eyes locking onto his. For a moment, she said nothing, and James wondered if he had overstepped by asking. But then she spoke, her voice softer than he expected. "I was thinking about home," she said, her gaze drifting back to the storm. "About the world I come from." James nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He didn't know much about her world, but he knew it was far from Earth, far from everything he knew. "What's it like there?" he asked, hoping his question wouldn't come off as too intrusive. Lyra's eyes seemed to soften as she considered his question. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice distant, as if she were remembering something long gone. "But it's also harsh. Survival is everything. We don't have the luxuries that you do here. It's a fight every day just to stay alive." James frowned, feeling a pang of sympathy. He couldn't imagine what it would be like to live in such a world. "That sounds tough," he said, his voice tinged with concern. Lyra nodded, her expression solemn. "It is," she replied. "But it's all we know. It's all I've known." There was a long pause, and James felt the weight of her words settle into the space between them. He didn't know how to respond, didn't know how to make her feel better, but he wanted to. "You don't have to fight anymore," he said quietly, his voice steady. "Not here. Not with me." Lyra turned to him, her golden eyes searching his face as if trying to read him. For a long moment, she said nothing, and James wondered if he had said the wrong thing. But then, finally she spoke. "I've never been given the chance to stop fighting," she said softly. "But maybe I'll try." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. James watched as Lyra slowly relaxed, her posture softening as she let her guard down for the first time since they had met. It was a small moment, but it meant something. The connection between them was growing, in ways that neither of them could fully understand. And in that moment, James realized that this journey, whatever it was, wasn't just about survival. It was about learning to trusting each other, trusting in something bigger than themselves. As the storm raged on outside, the two of them sat in the quiet warmth of the cave, the fire crackling softly between them. Neither of them spoke, but the understanding that had blossomed between them was enough. They didn't need words to know that they were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were something more now. And as the night stretched on, James couldn't help but feel that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The days began to blur together as James and Lyra settled into a routine, their connection growing stronger with each passing hour. The storm outside had finally passed, leaving behind a bitter cold that seemed to seep into the very bones of the planet. But inside their small shelter, warmth had slowly begun to return, not just from the fire, but from the quiet companionship they had started to share. James had always been a man of action, someone who relied on his training, his instincts. But with Lyra, he found himself questioning everything. Her presence was like a calm anchor in the storm, and he couldn't deny how much he had come to rely on her. They spent their days gathering more supplies, mapping the terrain, and planning for the next leg of their journey. There were still many miles to go before they reached safety, but for the first time, James didn't feel alone in the world. Lyra had become a constant by his side, her quiet strength giving him a sense of purpose that he hadn't realized he was missing. She had started to open up to him more, her earlier wariness now replaced with a quiet trust. Yet, James could still sense the weight she carried, the unspoken sadness in her eyes whenever she thought he wasn't looking. One evening, as they sat by the fire, James decided to break the silence. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice low, though the question wasn't just about their journey. Lyra looked up at him, her golden eyes reflecting the flames. "Next?" she echoed softly, her voice almost lost in the crackling of the fire. "We survive. We keep moving forward. That's what we do." James nodded, his gaze never leaving hers. "But after that, what do you want?" Lyra's eyes flickered with something he couldn't quite read. "What I want," she paused, as though searching for the right words. "I want peace. I want a chance to breathe. But that's not something I'm used to." Her words hung in the air between them, filled with a depth of emotion that James wasn't sure he fully understood. "You don't have to fight anymore," he said, the words coming out before he could stop them. "Not with me. Not here." Lyra's expression softened, and for the briefest moment, James saw something shift in her eyes, a vulnerability that she hadn't shown before. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted quietly. "I don't know what it's like to live without fighting, to just exist. It's been my whole life." James felt a pang of sympathy, but he also felt something else, a desire to help her find that peace she longed for. "Maybe it's time to learn," he said gently. "Maybe it's time for both of us." Lyra turned her gaze back to the fire, her mind clearly elsewhere. The weight of her past hung heavily in the quiet space between them, but for the first time, there was a glimmer of hope, a flicker of something new. "Maybe," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words, the crackling fire the only sound in the stillness. James felt a shift, something unspoken passing between them. There were still many questions, still many miles to go. But in this moment, it didn't matter. They weren't alone, and that was enough. As the night stretched on, James leaned back against the cave wall, his eyes never leaving Lyra. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid of it. Together, they would face whatever came next. The days stretched on, the bond between James and Lyra growing with each passing moment. They had learned to rely on one another, and the world outside seemed to fade in comparison to the quiet connection they were building. The cave had become their sanctuary, a place where they could rest and recover from the harshness of the planet. James found himself more at ease than he had been in years, the weight of his past fading into the background as he focused on the present. Lyra, too, had begun to change. The wariness she once carried had softened, replaced by a curiosity and a quiet strength that reminded him of her resilience. Yet, James could still see the shadow of the world she had left behind in her eyes. One afternoon, as they sat in the warmth of the cave, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows against the walls, James finally asked the question that had been on his mind for days. "What happens when we get out of here?" he asked, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. Lyra looked up at him, her golden eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment, she said nothing, as if weighing his words carefully. Finally, she spoke, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've spent my life running, surviving, fighting. I never thought about what would happen after." James nodded slowly, understanding her words more than she knew. He, too, had lived his life on the move, always looking ahead, never stopping to ask what came next. But now, with Lyra by his side, he realized how much he had been missing. "Maybe we don't have to have all the answers right now," he said, his voice more thoughtful than before. "Maybe we just take it one step at a time." Lyra looked at him, her eyes searching his face. There was something in the way she studied him, something that made him feel as though she were seeing him for the first time. Slowly, she nodded. "One step at a time," she echoed. It wasn't much, but it was enough. It was more than they had ever had before, hope, even if it was small. As the days passed, they continued their quiet existence, each day bringing them closer to the unknown future that awaited them. The planet had become a distant memory, and the only thing that mattered was the path ahead. One morning, after a long night of rest, they set out again, this time with a sense of purpose. They didn't know what they would find beyond the horizon, but for the first time in a long while, it didn't matter. The journey itself had become their destination. As they walked side by side, their footsteps falling in sync, James couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. And that thought, simple as it was, made all the difference. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid of the future. With Lyra by his side, he felt ready to face whatever came next. And as they moved forward into the unknown, James knew that this journey, this partnership, was something worth holding on to. As the days went by, James and Lyra found themselves on a path neither had anticipated. The planet had become a distant memory, the struggles and challenges of survival slowly being replaced by a sense of purpose they hadn't known they were missing. They were learning, each day, to trust one another in ways neither had imagined. They had built something together, something steady, despite the unknowns ahead. The journey had taken them deeper into unfamiliar terrain, but now there was an unspoken understanding between them. James wasn't just leading her anymore. They were walking side by side, moving forward together, without needing to look back. One morning, they came across a vast, open field. The ground stretched endlessly before them, dotted with small rocks and patches of grass that swayed gently in the breeze. The sky was clear, the sun bright, and the air had the warmth of early spring. For a moment, they stopped and simply stood there, taking in the beauty of the open space. It was a rare moment of calm in a world that had been anything but. James turned to Lyra, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "This is nice," he said, his voice almost in awe. Lyra looked at the horizon, her golden eyes reflecting the peaceful scene. "It is," she agreed softly, her gaze lingering on the sky. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. There was no need for words. The stillness around them seemed to echo a truth they both understood now. This was their moment, a rare chance to breathe, to simply exist without the constant push of survival. "What happens now?" James asked, his voice breaking the silence. Lyra turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "Now, we keep going," she said. "We don't stop. We can't stop." James nodded, feeling the weight of her words. She was right, of course. The journey wasn't over. There was still much to do, many unknowns to face. But in that moment, standing there with Lyra, he realized that they had already overcome so much. And that was something worth holding on to. "Together," he asked quietly, his gaze meeting hers. Lyra smiled, a soft, knowing smile that warmed him more than the sun ever could. "Together," she said. And so, they continued on, side by side, with nothing but the open road ahead of them and the unspoken promise that whatever lay in store, they would face it together. The world had changed for both of them, and so had they. As they walked forward into the unknown, James couldn't help but feel a sense of calm settle over him. Whatever challenges awaited them, they were no longer just two strangers thrown together by circumstance. They were a team, and that made all the difference. The journey continued, and with each step, James and Lyra grew more accustomed to the road ahead. The days were filled with moments of quiet camaraderie, as they shared stories from their worlds, learned from one another, and grew stronger together. The path before them was still uncertain, but there was a sense of peace in their shared determination. As they trekked across the barren landscape, the sun hanging low in the sky, James found himself reflecting on how far they had come. From the cliffs that had separated them to this quiet, uncharted part of the planet, their bond had grown deeper, grounded in mutual respect and an unspoken understanding. Lyra, once distant and uncertain, now moved with a quiet confidence beside him, her golden eyes scanning the horizon, always alert, but at peace. The world around them had begun to feel a little less alien, a little more like home. One evening, as they camped beneath the stars, James noticed the way the light danced across Lyra's face. The firelight flickered softly, casting shadows and highlights on her green skin, and for a brief moment, she seemed like a part of the night itself. He realized how much he had come to rely on her, not just as a companion, but as someone who had changed him in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. "You're quiet tonight," James said softly, breaking the silence. Lyra looked up at him, her gaze distant at first, then focused. "I was thinking," she replied, her voice low, "about the future, about what comes next." James raised an eyebrow, curious. "And what did you come up with?" She smiled, but it was a gentle, thoughtful smile. "I don't know, but I think we have more time now. Time to decide. Time to figure out what we really want." James considered her words. It was strange, but he realized she was right. For so long, they had just been surviving, moving from one moment to the next. But now, for the first time, they had a chance to shape their future, to choose what it would look like. "That's a nice thought," he said, his voice filled with quiet appreciation. "Maybe we should take the time to think about it." Lyra nodded, her golden eyes reflecting the stars above them. "I think that's what we've been doing all along," she said softly. "Taking the time, one step at a time." As the night deepened, the two of them sat in companionable silence, the fire crackling softly between them. The world around them seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet sound of the wind and the warmth of the fire. For the first time, James felt truly at peace. He wasn't running from anything anymore, and neither was Lyra. They had come to a place of understanding, a place where they could both look ahead and choose their path. As the embers of the fire glowed faintly in the night, James realized that, whatever the future held, they would face it together. And that thought gave him more hope than anything he had ever known. With Lyra by his side, the unknowns of the world no longer seemed so daunting. The path ahead was unclear, but that didn't matter. Together, they had found something worth fighting for. And for the first time, James wasn't afraid to move forward, whatever the next step would be.